Thank you, Steve. Is the microphone still working? Steve's comment on Chicago and Harvard made me think about the time that I tried to decide whether I should stay on at the University of Chicago for a PhD or go to Harvard. And I had a friend who had been in both programs, both at Harvard and Chicago, so I thought he would be a good person to ask where I should go. And I said, where should I go? And he said, well, you should go to Harvard, of course. And I said, well, but I think the University of Chicago is actually a better university. And he said, well, of course it is, but where do you want to live? Boston or in Chicago? And so I went off to Boston, or Cambridge, Massachusetts, I guess. I'd like to start out by reading to you a part of an article that I saw. This was just last week. When this started out, this is referring to a teaching about religion in public school. And so maybe why don't you think about what state you imagine this takes place in. I'll tell you that it was not Missouri, but here we go. It refers to the school teacher who, quote, set aside her textbook, strode before her second graders, and as if speaking from a pulpit, posed a simple question. I remember this is in state school, public school. Whom should we learn to do good from? From God, the children said. Right, the teacher said, because people he created crucified him. But did he accuse them or curse them or hate them? Of course not. He continued loving and feeling pity for them, though he could have eliminated all of us and the whole world in a fraction of a second. And then it says the reporter talked to some of the kids in the class, with the teacher having said that this is really not a course promoting religion, this is a course that is just teaching about religion to the second graders. So the reporter says, the children seem to have their own understanding of the primary theme of the course. One has to love God, said one student. We should believe in God only. So that was the message that came from the public school. Now, I don't know if you want to guess which state this was in, whether maybe Mississippi or Louisiana. Well, the state it's referring to is Russia. So this is a course that was being taught in Russia. And in Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church has been encouraging and has promoted a curriculum that would teach religion in public schools in Russia. And it is said by the Orthodox Church that this is not promoting orthodoxy, it is promoting Slavic traditions and culture. Those in Russia who do not like a particular course say, no, this is promoting the Russian Orthodox Church. And 10 Nobel Prize winners in Russia just signed a letter to President Putin asking him to put an end to this practice. So it doesn't happen only here in America. As Steve just mentioned, I work as an advisor to the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe on a panel of experts on religion. And the OSCE, if you are not aware of it, is what began as the Helsinki process, so the Helsinki Final Act signed in 1975, and all of the states who were members of NATO and all of the states and countries who were members of NATO or Warsaw Pact are parts of OSCE, so there are now 56 countries that are participating in this, including the United States. In one other panel of experts, we've just been working over the last 6 months to prepare what are called guiding principles on teaching religion in public schools. So once again, if you think we have it difficult in the United States on this, we have 50 states. Well, there are 56 states in the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and we need to somehow try and coordinate how religion should be taught in public schools in these states. I'm going to drop away from that particular issue, but I'm going to come back to that at the end of how we think about speaking about that. In the United States, when we talk about religion, and we talk about religion in the public schools, we often don't have civilized discussions, as the part I've heard about today in the various meetings. So it's not a subject that is, whereas we might talk about it sensibly and how do we do this fairly, how do we teach about religion objectively. Well, often in the public debates in the United States, it's really part of the culture wars. I had this experience just a couple of weeks ago when I was asked by USA Today to write an op-ed about the issue of Muslim foot baths that have been adopted or been installed in some public state universities. And that's caused a controversy, so I wrote what I thought was a balanced op-ed piece trying to explain the complexity of the issue. Well, they published just Monday of this week a response by Tim LaHaye. If you know Tim LaHaye, he's the author of the Left Behind series, thank you. So he's the author of the Left Behind series, so he's a little bit richer than I am now. But in his response, I thought it was quite interesting that he in fact did not refer to anything that I said in his article. And he said that I did not disclose that the principle of separation of church and state was not in the Constitution. Well, that's true. I didn't disclose that that was not in the Constitution, but I never even used the term separation of church and state in my article. What I had done was try to talk about some of the complexity of the issues, and he came back with a club and hit me on the issue of separation of church and state. What he wanted to do was have a fight about what we are as a country, rather than have a discussion about how do we resolve this complex issue in a country where we take religion seriously, where we take the practice of religion seriously, and I hope we take the Constitution seriously. Instead of engaging on the level that the article was, that my op-ed was, it was he wanted to have a culture war. And culture wars are in fact a lot of what we are doing today in the country. Now the term culture war, I'm sure it's been around for a long time, but it first gained prominence at first in an academic study that was published in 1991, but then it became part of the public lexicon in 1992 in a speech that Patrick Buchanan gave in the 1992 Republican Convention. And here is what Patrick Buchanan said then. My friends, this election is about much more than who gets what. Some of us might have thought that's what the election was about. But it is about who we are. It is about what we believe. It is about what we stand for as Americans. There is a religious war going on in our country for the soul of America. It is a cultural war as critical to the kind of nation we will one day be as was the Cold War itself. So in 1991, the year before the culture war speech, the Soviet Union collapsed, divided into 12 separate states. The Soviet Union ended, we had Russia and 12 former states in the former Soviet Union. So as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, then we are in a religious war in the United States. And you ask whether that's a little bit extreme, whether we are killing each other over religion in the United States, or whether we have a rhetorical religious war where we make accusations about others and we are suspicious of each other's intentions and what the others are trying to do. I would like to suggest to you that this struggle, this cultural war, this battle that Patrick Buchanan and others speak of, is not really a war about simply, or is not really a struggle about how we should think about religion in public schools or think about religion in society, but it's a war that is actually over what we think of as being our identity. That we're having a struggle over symbols, we're not having a struggle over how do we practically resolve and deal with these issues. And I think that when it is turned into language as a culture war and cultural struggles, I think that we are all the losers for this. Let me give you an example of something that happened to me. This is a trip that I took when I had just been in Kazakhstan in Central Asia, one of the former states of the Soviet Union, where I was working, among others, with some Baptists that were being persecuted in Kazakhstan, not by the state itself in this particular case, but by some social groups who did not believe that there should be Baptists or evangelical Christians in this particular region in Kazakhstan. So I'm returning from Kazakhstan. I change planes in Frankfurt, and I sit next to a woman who introduces herself to me as follows. She says, "I am an evangelical Christian." And I thought, this is going to be a long plane ride. Nothing against evangelical Christians and nothing against discussing that. But when that's the introduction, one does worry about when dinner's coming and other such things. So she explained to me that her husband was a chaplain in the U.S. Army based in Europe, and she had just been over giving some lectures to the chaplains' wives, which at least suggested that either in her mind or in reality that chaplains were men, and that the men were all married to women. So we had that particular division already. that after she had talked to me a little bit about this, she said, "What do you do?" I was not working for the ACLU at the time, or we probably would have had a very short conversation. But I said that I was working on issues related to religious freedom internationally. I thought she might like that. It would be a good way of discussing this. And she said, well, you know, we don't have religious freedom here. And she wasn't referring to the Lufthansa airplane, but she was referring to the United States. We don't have religious freedom here. And I again looked at my watch thinking this is going to be a long plane ride. And then I said something I knew I shouldn't have said. I said, what do you mean by that? And she said, well, let me give you an example. Here, in Texas, she's from Texas. She said, we can't pray before football games. And I thought, well, the Baptists I was just meeting in Kazakhstan weren't really worried about praying before football games or anything. In fact, they were worried about state-sponsored prayers. They didn't like state-sponsored prayers. And if you have prayers in public schools in Kazakhstan, they're Muslim prayers. And the Baptists who live in Kazakhstan don't want to be forced to say Muslim prayers, and they don't want to be set aside for Muslim prayers. But the good evangelical woman from Texas was concerned about not being able to have prayers before football games. And now, you could say that actually perhaps football is the religion in Texas rather than prayer, but we do like combining them. One thing I've always wondered is why don't we have prayers after the football games? Why do we pray before we go into battle rather than after the battle is finished? But that was the notion of what she had, why something was wrong in the United States. I had the interesting experience that a few months later, or a few years later, when I was at the ACLU, I read an op-ed, an editorial in what turns out to be my hometown newspaper, Provo, Utah, that said the ACLU never passes up the opportunity to kick religion in the teeth. So I sent a very friendly response saying, I happen to be the head of the program on freedom of religion and belief at the ACLU. I just happen to be coming to speak at BYU next week. Maybe we could get together and talk about your editorial. So I went and met with the editor. I said I also used to formerly deliver newspapers for the Provo Daily Herald, and I'm sure that surprised them that someone who was so closely associated with the devil could have delivered their paper in earlier days of their life. But in this conversation that I had with them, the editorial board, they made reference to the same football case that I talked about, which was Santa Fe versus Doe, which was an ACLU case. And they used that as an example of the ACLU being against religion. So I said to the editorial board of the Provo Daily Herald, do you know who the plaintiffs were in the Santa Fe versus Doe case? And they didn't know. What they thought of is this was a case of religion versus secularism, or religion versus atheism. So I said, well, there were two plaintiffs in the case, two families. One was a Catholic family, and one was a Mormon family. Now, when I say Mormon family, then at the Provo Daily Herald, they pick up on that. And the question is, why are the Mormons filing suit in Texas about prayers before football games? And the answer is, these were not Mormon prayers that were being offered before football games. There are a lot of people who think that Mormons are not Christians in Texas. And there are a lot of people who think that Mitt Romney should not be elected president because he's not a Christian, but he is a Mormon. And as soon as I said that, I thought a light went off. I don't know whether a light went on. I don't know how long the light stayed on or if it went off. But somehow it seemed different as soon as you say, my people are getting hurt by religion in schools rather than religion versus secularism or religion versus atheism. Now, when we think about the culture wars in the United States, there are a few issues that immediately come up. Unfortunately, one that I keep being saddled with is the issue of the Ten Commandments. So you hear the story, the fights about Ten Commandments on courthouse lawns. One thing I don't know if you know, that the Ten Commandments monuments that exist around the country have not been there since time immemorial. The founding fathers did not erect any Ten Commandments monuments. They really began in 1955. That's when the stone monuments can be dated. Cecil B. DeMille was over filming his movie, The Ten Commandments in Sinai, when he got the idea, why don't we erect some monuments, some bronze monuments for the Ten Commandments? So he called a person who had been associated with the Eagles movement to promote paper versions of the Ten Commandments, and that particular person, who was a judge, said, don't do it in bronze, do it in stone. That's the way that God did it. Now, whether Cecil B. DeMille was confusing who he was with the author of the Ten Commandments, I don't know. But Cecil B. DeMille thought that's a great idea. And so he started commissioning the erection of Ten Commandments monuments around the country. 1955, the movie was released in 1956. For Cecil B. DeMille, this was a great combination of capitalism, promoting his movie, and doing a little bit of religious evangelism on the side. He believed in the Ten Commandments, he believed in his movie, and he wanted to make money. And so, in the perfect American combination to get religion and capitalism together, that's where the Ten Commandments stone monuments came from, not from the founding fathers. But we often hear about how we should have the Ten Commandments erected on public property or not. And I suspect that, once again, this is not really an issue about whether we're trying to promote religion or religious beliefs, but I suspect that this is really something different. That what we're talking about really is an identity struggle. But what we want is a stone monument, not obedience to the Ten Commandments. So you look to say that often people who believe in the Ten Commandments believe the Bible should be taken literally, and we should follow the Ten Commandments. I don't find anyone today saying, I believe that the punishments that were established in the Hebrew Bible for violation of the Ten Commandments should be instituted in America today. They don't talk about that, by the way, for violating the Sabbath day. That was death. And what day is the Sabbath? Well, of course, in the Hebrew Bible, it's the seventh day, which is Saturday. And so, do we want to honor the Sabbath day and not have football games on Saturday, or even if you prefer Sunday, we're going to say no more football games. Anybody who wants the NFL, if you want to have your football game on Sunday, we're going to stone you to death. We're not talking about that. What we want is a stone monument to it. We don't want to observe them. We don't say, I'm going to make sure that I and my children observe the Ten Commandments. We're going to say, I insist that my monument be put on your government property. I don't know if you saw Congressman Lynn Westmoreland interviewed on Stephen Colbert, and I have on the impeccable authority of Bill O'Reilly that when Stephen Colbert was a child, he was known as Stevie Colbert. Anyway, Congressman Westmoreland appeared on the Colbert rapport, and Congressman Westmoreland had said that what we need to do is have a monument to the Ten Commandments in the Capitol building. And Mr. Colbert, or Mr. Colbert, said, oh, really? Is that the best place that you can think of for them? And Westmoreland said, yes. And Colbert said, well, can you think of any other place that might be more appropriate for the Ten Commandments, clearly applying churches? And Congressman Westmoreland could not. Then Stephen Colbert said, well, how many of the Ten Commandments can you name? And Congressman Westmoreland, who thought that these were the foundations of American government, struggles to try and think of what the Ten Commandments were. He wanted a monument for them, and he wanted to be known as the congressional sponsor of a monument, to put a religious monument on government property, to put it in the Capitol building, but he wasn't even sure of what they were. And I'll bet you that he probably was not honoring the Sabbath day and keeping it holy, particularly if we think of the Sabbath day as being Saturday. And I'm not trying to disparage this religion in any way, shape, or form. But which is it that we prefer? Erecting monuments to these, or do we prefer observing them? And which are we really talking about? Is it a battle over identity and monuments, or is it a battle to understand religion? Well, this idea of the Ten Commandments, it pervades, or things similar to the Ten Commandments, pervade our public discussion in the culture wars on religion. Let me give you another example. One that gets a lot of people excited is the Pledge of Allegiance, and the adding of the term under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, if you remember just a minute ago, I said that the Ten Commandments monuments began in 1955. Well, under God in the Pledge of Allegiance came, not unsurprisingly and not coincidentally, 1 year before in 1954, when it was introduced, the spokesman for inserting under God in the Pledge of Allegiance said this would be a way to fight the communists. It will show the communists that we are not like them. Now, remember when I quoted Patrick Buchanan saying that we're now in a culture war over religion in America, and it's like the Cold War? Well, we already had that war over religion in the 1950s when we put the under God into the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, a few years ago, in 2004, the Ninth Circuit struck down the under God provision of the Pledge of Allegiance and said that that was unconstitutional and violated the Establishment Clause of the Constitution. So a decision of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals based in the western part of the United States. The United States Congress, both Senate and House, immediately dropped all other business. The war on terrorism took an immediate side, and we needed to reaffirm our pledge for the Pledge of Allegiance and to put under God. Let me just quote you what some of the Democrats said about that. Hillary Rodham Clinton, you may have heard of her, she came out and said that she was personally offended by the decision of the Ninth Circuit. And she thought that this is part of the moral foundation and moral fiber of our country. Senator Robert Byrd, a Democrat who prides himself on being a constitutional expert in the Senate, said that any judge who made a decision saying under God the Pledge of Allegiance should be struck down, should be, one word that Senator Byrd used, blackballed. The Senate Majority Leader, Tom Daschle, said that the judges who made that decision were nuts. So those are what the Democrats said about that nuts and blackballed, one word responses to this. You can imagine what Republicans said. The Senate and House immediately voted resolutions reapproving and reaffirming support for under God and the Pledge of Allegiance. Now let's ask the question, why do we want under God and the Pledge of Allegiance? People say this is part of the moral foundation of our country, it shows who we are, we want our children saying that. So we ask the question, how important is the Pledge of Allegiance as a symbol versus how important is it as part of education? So I'll ask the question rhetorically, I don't know the answer to this. How many senators who came out and protested the Ninth Circuit decision, when they are home alone, do they pledge allegiance to the flag? Or do they do it only when they can be seen by others? Is it really part of what they think of as important, or is it really part of showing themselves to others? To ask those senators and Congress people who voted for it. When your children were home for summer vacation, how many mornings did you get up with your children and recite the Pledge of Allegiance with them? How many times? When you're on the weekends, on Saturday and Sunday, the Sabbath and the other day, whichever one that is. How many times on those days did you get up with your children and recite the Pledge of Allegiance? Is it that the Pledge of Allegiance is important, or is it that somehow we say that it is important and we have public manifestations of it? Which is it about? Is this something where we're trying to claim our identity, or is it something that we are really interested in the moral education that it provides? I asked the question rhetorically. I think you can probably figure out what my own answer to that is. Another one that we have a lot is public prayer, or let's call it government-sponsored or government-approved prayer. Now, prayer is important, of course, and prayer for people, for many people, is communion with God. And that's a very important thing. But when do we have, you may know about the National Prayer Day, National Prayer Breakfast that's held. Do you know when that started, when the National Prayer Breakfast started? Well, we're going backwards. We started with the Ten Commandments in 1955. We go to 1954 for under God and the Pledge of Allegiance. And if you're doing the math, it was 1953 that the Presidential Prayer Breakfast came. And the first president to participate in that, obviously it's 1953, is Dwight David Eisenhower. So that's when the Presidential Prayer Breakfast began. And once again, we had a nice blending of capitalism and religion. The person who sponsored this was Conrad Hilton. That may not be popular here in Springfield, Missouri, but it was popular in the United States at the time. And so Conrad Hilton paid to have several hundred people come and have a prayer breakfast with the President of the United States, so members of Congress. It now turns out to be a society event in Washington. You have to pay money to go, and you want to have your table closer to influential people. You want to be, as the Bible would say, seen of men when you are offering your very public prayers. Well, what did Jesus say about public prayers? I'm not going to quote it for you, but I'll give you the scripture if you want to look it up. It's Matthew 6, 5 and 6. What did Jesus say about public prayer? Now, there's a website for the National Prayer Breakfast. And then on the website, which is the website itself is run by evangelical Christians. Tim LaHaye, my friend, Tim LaHaye, his wife runs the National Prayer Breakfast. You can go on that, and they cite scriptures on the website, and they talk about the importance of prayer, and they talk about the importance of religion, they talk about the importance of Christianity. But my goodness, I keep looking and looking, and they don't quote the one scripture where Jesus actually talked about public prayer. That's the one scripture they picked, the one I mentioned, Matthew 6, 5, and 6. Why is it that they missed that? Now I'll give you a hint about what the scripture says, but read it for yourself. Those who want to be prayed in public get their own reward. If you want to be heard of God, go and do your prayers in private. So that's what Jesus said about public prayers. But in all the public prayers, the public, and it's now part of national law, Congress enacts laws to encourage prayers. There are probably around 15 different laws about public prayers and when public prayers should be held. In none of those, in none of the testimony supporting it, does anyone ever quote the actual scripture about it. So is it that we are interested in the religious education and we're interested in religion, or are we interested in cultural symbols for attacking those who reject our symbols? Which is it? I'm asking lots of rhetorical questions. Now, the issue that we have on religion and public schools, this is an important issue in the country, and it's often said in parts of, in terms of the public debate in the country. I don't know whether you've heard this as often as I have, but it was sort of things were going fine in the United States in the 1950s until the Supreme Court came along and took prayer and Bible reading out of public schools. That's when things broke down. So Jerry Falwell, in his first manifesto on this issue called Listen America, I think it was published around 1981-82, said this is when he became active in politics. After the Supreme Court, in his terms, took out prayer and Bible reading from school, he decided he needed to get involved in politics. He'd given a speech, a sermon a little bit before that called Ministers and Marchers, where he criticized people who were clergy people who would go on marches and demonstrations. He was referring specifically to Martin Luther King. Religion and politics don't mix, he said, when it was talking about the Civil Rights Movement. But when after the Supreme Court, he said, took religion, or took prayer and Bible reading out of public schools, that's when he became involved. So we say, in one way, that's the beginning of part of the religious right. Billy James Hargis, who used to be famous until he ended up having some of his own problems, said that's what got him involved in politics as well. So one of the major leaders of what we think of as religious right from the 1950s. His son, Billy James Hargis II, was around 12 years old when the Supreme Court made the decisions in 62 and 63. And I've seen him interviewed on videotape where he said, that is the day he found Christ. So he realized something was wrong, and so 12-year-old Billy James Hargis II went on his knees and found Christ because the Supreme Court had taken this out. And part of the story, and I have several quotations here, but I will skip over those. Part of the story is things went to hell in a handbasket after he took the prayers out. And so the 1960s became a time of decadence and corruption. And so there's the litany of sex, drugs, violence, all the 1960s. And look at some of the dates that we have here that might seem to at first support this causality. Supreme Court takes Bible and prayer out of schools, and look what happens next. We have the 1967, it's the summer of love in Haight-Ashbury, really the beginning of the hippie movement. Mamas and the papas then write, if you're going to San Francisco, wear flowers in your hair, referring to the summer of love in Haight-Ashbury, 1967. Free love becomes a widely used term, if not the first time that it's used. Timothy Leary is speaking about turn on, tune in, drop out. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album is released by the Beatles, and there's a dispute about whether it's really about drugs or not, and I don't care what the answer to that is, whether Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is really LSD, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, or not. You can decide that or ask someone else. But it was perceived at the time as being about drugs. And Huey Newton picks up a shotgun and point-blank range kills an Oakland police officer, widely perceived as this is violence, and it's still disputed about whether he acted in self-defense or not. But that's 1967. 1968, we have the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. We had the student strike at Columbia. There are riots at the Chicago Democratic Convention in Chicago. President Johnson cannot speak at universities because he's either shouted out or there are too many security threats. 1969, we have Woodstock, more sex, drugs, free love. Harvard student strike. The nationwide Vietnam moratorium. Sharon Tate is killed. Sharon Tate and her colleagues is killed by Charles Manson. That's 1969. The world is going to hell in a handbasket, we can say. In 1970, we have the Kent State killings. Angela Davis is arrested in New York. Janis Joplin dies from a heroin overdose at age 27. It used to seem to be really, really old. Jimi Hendrix died presumably of a drug overdose at age 32. That was certainly over the hill. 1971, the year following, Jim Morrison dies at age 27, also presumably of a drug overdose. So we can see with this causality that you can find, go on the internet, this causality. The Supreme Court does this, religion's taken out of public schools, look what ends up happening, the country goes to hell in a handbasket. Well, let's try some examinations of that causality. Does that really work? Or do we just assume that after the fact, therefore because of the fact, the old ergo hoc, ergo propter, excuse me. So, 1962-63, how old were these leaders of this youth rebellion in 1962-63? Well, Angela Davis was 18, so I guess she'd already escaped the school system. Sirhan, the alleged assassin of Robert Kennedy, was 18. Jimi Hendrix was 20. Huey Newton was 20. Jim Morrison was 21. So I guess taking prayer and Bible reading out of schools didn't really affect that generation. Janis Joplin was 21. Charles Manson, 28. James Earl Ray, alleged assassin of Martin Luther King, was 34. And that old Timothy Leary was 42 when the Supreme Court made those decisions. So maybe it wasn't in terms of the leaders. Well, what about the shock troops? Maybe it was those impressionable youths who were actually doing these things. And let's assume that the youths are approximately age 20 in this period of 1967 to 1971 period. Okay, so 1967, 71. Well, let's go and see where were they? What years were they in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade? How old were they then? Well, if we go back 15 years early, so the 20-year-olds at this particular period of time, 20-year-olds at the time of the peak of the youth rebellion, what was happening in schools when they were in kindergarten? So we go back to, well, this takes us to, unfortunately, 1952 and 1953. So what's going on in public schools in 1952 and 53? Well, President Eisenhower was elected in 1952. I've already told you about the National Prayer Breakfast. Eisenhower, first President of the United States, in his inaugural address began by saying, let me offer a private little prayer. Now that's the prayer that Eisenhower gives in his inaugural address is on live television, and it sort of makes you wonder what the meaning of the word private is when the President of the United States is giving a prayer on live national television. 1954, as we mentioned, Under God Goes Into the Pledge of Allegiance. So we now have these things, and In God We Trust went on coins on dollar bills in 1955. We have the Cecil B. DeMille movie that Congress puts in a prayer room in the Capitol building in 1955. National motto becomes, in 1956, becomes In God We Trust. So during the time, these youth rebellions in the 1960s, during the time they were in the formative years, was exactly the time that religion was being put into the system. So if we go to all these people who are complaining and say, now wait a minute, maybe the reason we had the youth rebellion was that people were trying to put too much religion in it. Now, I don't think that has anything to do with it, so that's not my causality. Well, I'll say it's a lot better causality if you're going to make it than what we have with the others where it doesn't make any sense at all. But suppose I go to Tim LaHaye and give him my causality. Do you think he's going to say something like, you're right, it is a problem? Or do you think he's going to have no interest whatsoever in the causality? Are we really dealing with a battle over ideology rather than really trying to understand what is going on and what is really happening in terms of education? Let me conclude with a couple of points. I'm trying to be brief with this. Sort of questions, what do we do about religion in schools? I was attending the previous session where the question was talking about teaching religion in schools. And this becomes a controversial issue if you're talking about it from a culture war, where there's the false imagination by some people, and I hear it every day, that if you try and teach about religion in public schools, the ACLU will come in and sue you. And let me tell you right today that that's just not true. If you try and promote religious beliefs, your religious beliefs in public schools, well, then you might hear from the ACLU. But if you are trying to adopt a curriculum that teaches about religion, that tries to do it in something like an objective way, and perfect objectivity is not possible this side of the veil of tears, so you can't be perfect about this. But if your school is making a good faith effort to teach about religion, to try and teach it in a balanced and fair way, to respect the different beliefs of students, and to try and show them and understand, have better understanding whether you're teaching a Bible-only course or whether you're teaching comparative religion. You're not going to be sued by the ACLU. You're more likely to be sued by people who want a particular religious doctrine to be taught in public schools, and if that particular religious doctrine is not promoted in public schools, then they're not going to be happy about that. There are many examples of that sort of thing happening. So the problem is not teaching about religion. My PhD is in religion. I happen to think that religious education is a good idea. I happen to think that if people had known a little bit more about religion, we probably would not have invaded Iraq, or would not have invaded Iraq so easily. That what you're doing when you invade a country like Iraq, if you don't understand religion, is you're wrecking open a hornet's nest, the consequences of which are quite clear, whether it's a good idea for other reasons or not. That particular issue was easily anticipated by those who knew Iraq and who knew religion. It was not anticipated by people who support the war. Again, whatever your position on the war is, that was an issue that should have been taken into account and was not taken into account. If we understand each other's religions, I would hope that we would be able to get along a little bit better. But also we shouldn't be Pollyanna-ish about this. Sometimes the more you learn about somebody else's religion, the less you like it. And that's a possibility too. Now, I think that's not usually the case. And the best case where this was actually studied was in Modesto, California, where there's a compulsory religion course, and where the surprising result for those who had done the project with detailed studies afterwards is that children came out liking their own religion more and respecting their own religion more when they learned about others' religions. So exactly the opposite of what some people would predict, and that may be an aberration or not, but that's the one best study that we have that would suggest learning about other religions teaches you more respect for your own religion, and it teaches you more respect for others' religion. So it's been a success in Modesto. But not everybody who learns about religion, sometimes the more I learn about religions, the less I am attracted to them. But let me try and give you three different, and I'll just do this very quickly, three different sort of guidelines or three different standards, I think, that make sense. And I base this both upon the work that's being done in the United States, and I particularly commend Charles Haynes at the First Freedom Center in Washington, D.C. on this, who's done a lot of excellent work and worked with Modesto. And also Martha Ball has done the Triple R project, started in Utah, but it's extended to other places. Here's some things that come partly from them, and also partly the work that I did with the Organization Security and Cooperation in Europe. When I was working with my fellow panel members, when we started out when things were chaos and people had different approaches to this, we ended up centering around some of these ideas. So it's worked in the United States with our many different political and religious and pedagogical issues. It has tended to work when it's been tried seriously. And it worked with our panel of experts when we tried to do this. So the three sorts of issues, of course, this doesn't solve all the problems, but three things worth thinking about. Number one, the promotion of particular religious beliefs or faith perspectives or upholding religious beliefs is the responsibility of parents and religious communities. It is not the responsibility of public schools. So somebody who thinks that religion should be taught in public schools, and they're suggesting that evangelical religion or some other thing should be taught in public schools, the question is, who should be responsible for children's religious education? Parents or public schools? When put to them in that way, they shouldn't have a problem answering it. No, that's for parents. Parents are the ones who should be teaching issues about faith and belief. That is where the proper inculcation of religious faith and belief takes place, in the family, in the religious community. The second issue, that schools, public schools, can teach about religion and should teach about religion if they are doing it with an academic focus, trying to be neutral, and that's not a magic word that solves all problems. They should try and do it academically rigorously. So it should be scholarly and academic. And you are teaching about religions from different perspectives. You're not promoting Christianity and tearing down Islam or vice versa. You're not attacking Judaism, but you're trying to teach children about religion from other people's perspectives. And public schools can do that. And it's probably a good idea for them to do that if they try and do it in a conscientious way. And that's a problematic issue. There's a lot of work that's going on how to do that. And one of the important things is to involve parents and communities when you do that. If parents hear, okay, the school's going to be teaching religion, all of a sudden you're going to immediately have parents, whether they are the secular humanists or evangelical Christians, who are immediately going to be suspicious of what's going on. So it's important to work with parents, but that's beyond what I want to talk about. But schools can do it, they can do it constitutionally if they focus on trying to teach it objectively within the realm of possibility, scholarly from an academic perspective. And the third issue that I think that is so important, and Charles Haynes figured this out in the United States, and it ended up working finally with a rather difficult group with my fellow members of the panel of experts. It took a while to get there, but we finally all got down to this. There's often a presumption that when you teach about religion, you are teaching respect for religion. And let me suggest to you not to think about it that way. Now, that might happen. And I think it probably happens in the majority of cases. But teaching about religion does not necessarily teach respect for religion. I can read about religion and say, I don't believe this. I think it's crazy. I don't see how somebody can believe it. I don't respect the religion. So it's not teaching the respect for religion. The core is, the crux is, and please, if you take one thing away from what I'm saying today, please take this one away, is what we should be teaching is the respect for the rights of children and their parents to hold religious beliefs. So the respect is the respect for the rights of conscience for people to believe what they want to believe. And so you can start out in the class when you're teaching about religion, teach about it from either a constitutional point of view, as we would say in the United States, or from a human rights perspective when we do it on an international basis, is teach the fundamental right of every student in the class to have religious beliefs, to share the religious beliefs with others. That's a fundamental right, and we should respect the right of conscience in all students. That's the key. And by the end of the class, then the teacher should be saying, and the student should be saying, I respect my fellow students and their right to have beliefs, and I want them to respect my rights to have beliefs. So that's the key, a constitutional framework or a human rights framework. That's the key, the rights of individuals to have their beliefs and to share those beliefs. And once that is done, then we start learning about the other beliefs, and we understand why Johnny or Sue or Aisha has a different point of view, but because we are respecting the other person, it's going to make it easier to understand their religion. So I would suggest that rather than dealing with these issues of religion and the culture, religion in schools, in the culture wars way, which people like to do, let's try and do it in a practical way so that we are learning about religion, learning about each other, but certainly doing it from the perspective of trying to respect the rights of other human beings to have their own beliefs. Thank you.